David Chen had always been different from other kids. While they played video games or kicked soccer balls in the park, he spent hours at the piano bench, his small fingers dancing across black and white keys. By age 7, he could play pieces that made grown-ups stop and stare. By 12, he was winning competitions across the state. By 18, he had full scholarships to 3 different music schools. Now, at 32, David was living the dream that every classical musician chased. His name appeared on concert hall posters in gold letters. Music critics wrote long articles about his breathtaking technique and commanding stage presence. His agent's phone rang constantly with booking requests from venues around the world. Last month alone, he had performed at Lincoln Center in New York, the Royal Albert Hall in London, and the Sydney Opera House. But success had changed David in ways he didn't even notice. The shy boy who once practiced quietly in his family's small apartment had become someone who expected the world to revolve around him. When he walked into restaurants, he expected to be recognized. When he stayed at hotels, he demanded the best rooms. When he met other musicians, he sized them up like a predator studying prey. On this particular evening, David found himself at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel for a charity fundraiser. The event was raising money for children's hospitals, and David had agreed to make an appearance. Not to perform, mind you, just to show up, shake some hands, and let people take photos with him. His agent had assured him it would be good for his image. The hotel's ballroom was filled with well-dressed donors sipping wine and writing checks. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light over round tables covered in white linen. A stage had been set up at one end of the room, but most of the evening's entertainment came from a baby grand piano positioned near the bar. The woman playing the piano looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. She wore a simple black dress, nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention away from the guests or their conversations. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she sat with perfect posture, her fingers moving smoothly across the keys. David barely glanced at her when he first entered the room. To him, she was just part of the furniture, like the flowers on the tables or the waiters carrying trays of appetizers. Background music, played by a background person, for background listening. He had more important things to focus on, like the line of people waiting to meet him. "Mr. Chen, what an honor," gushed Mrs. Patterson, a wealthy widow who donated regularly to arts organizations. "I saw your performance of Rachmaninoff's second last month. Simply divine." David smiled his practiced smile and shook her hand. "Thank you so much. The acoustics in that hall really bring out the best in Rachmaninoff's composition." As the evening continued, David worked the room like a politician. He posed for selfies with starstruck music students. He signed programs and napkins. He told the same stories about his career over and over, each time making them sound fresh and spontaneous. But throughout all of this, his ears kept picking up the music from the piano. The woman, he overheard someone call her Maria, was playing a mix of jazz standards, light classical pieces, and even some pop songs arranged for piano. Nothing too challenging, nothing that would compete with the conversations happening around the room. Just pleasant, professional background music. Yet something about her playing nagged at David. Her touch was clean, her timing perfect. When she played The Way You Look Tonight, her left hand created a walking bass line that most hotel pianists couldn't manage. When she shifted to a Chopin waltz, her phrasing was surprisingly sophisticated. Still, David told himself, it was just cocktail music. Anyone could play that stuff. It wasn't real music, not like the complex pieces he performed on the world's greatest stages. Around 9 o'clock, a small group of guests gathered around Maria's piano. David was between conversations and found himself drifting closer to listen. "Could you play something from Phantom of the Opera?" asked a young woman. "My daughter loves that musical." Maria smiled warmly. "Of course. Any particular song?" "Music of the Night would be wonderful." As Maria began to play, David had to admit she handled the piece well. Her arrangement was tasteful, not too showy, but it captured the drama of the original. A few people hummed along quietly. When she finished, an elderly man with a thick German accent spoke up. "You know, my wife and I saw Chopin's Ballad No. 1 performed in Vienna last year. Magnificent piece. Don't suppose you know it?" David perked up at this. Chopin's first ballad was one of his signature pieces, a work that demanded both technical skill and deep musical understanding. He had performed it at Carnegie Hall just 6 months ago to a standing ovation. Maria paused, her hands resting on the keys. "I do know the piece, but I think it might be a bit much for tonight. It's such a powerful work. It really deserves the full attention of the audience." The German gentleman nodded understandingly, but David felt a spark of irritation. A bit much? Was she saying the piece was too difficult for her, or that the audience wasn't sophisticated enough to appreciate it? Either way, her response struck him as an excuse. "Perhaps something lighter then," the man suggested, "whatever you think best." Maria launched into a gentle version of Autumn Leaves, and the small crowd around the piano began to disperse. But David remained, studying her more closely now. She was clearly comfortable at the keyboard, but her reluctance to attempt the Duel Chopin piece confirmed his suspicions. She was a competent hotel pianist, nothing more. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, David felt the familiar mix of satisfaction and emptiness that came after these social events. He had been admired, complimented, and photographed. His agent would be pleased with the exposure. But there was something hollow about it all, something that made him feel like he was going through the motions. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was just the contrast between his grand performances and this intimate hotel setting. But David found himself thinking about the piano music that had filled the room all evening. It hadn't been challenging or groundbreaking, but it had served its purpose perfectly. People had enjoyed their conversations more because of it. The atmosphere had been warmer and more welcoming. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Maria had been playing it safe all night. The way she had declined to play the Chopin ballad bothered him. In his world, you didn't turn down opportunities to showcase your skills. You seized every chance to prove you belonged among the elite. As David collected his coat and prepared to leave, he glanced one more time toward the piano. Maria was quietly packing up her sheet music, moving with the same understated grace she had shown all evening. She looked tired but content, like someone who had done an honest day's work. For a brief moment, David felt something he couldn't quite identify. Was it curiosity, respect, or perhaps just the recognition that there were many different ways to make a living as a musician? But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by his usual confidence in his own superior position in the music world. After all, he was David Chen, concert pianist. Tomorrow he would fly to Chicago for a performance with the symphony orchestra. Next week he would record a new album for a major classical music label. Maria, whoever she was, would probably be back here next weekend, playing the same background music for another group of distracted guests. As his driver held open the car door, David felt secure in his place at the top of the musical pyramid. He had no idea that in just a few weeks he would return to this same hotel, meet this same quiet pianist, and have his entire understanding of music turned upside down. 3 weeks later, David found himself back at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. This time it wasn't for a charity event. His agent had booked him for a private concert in the hotel's smaller ballroom, an intimate gathering of wealthy music lovers who paid premium prices for exclusive performances. The evening had gone perfectly. David had played a challenging program that included Liszt, Chopin, and Rachmaninoff. The audience of 50 guests had hung on every note, and the standing ovation had lasted nearly 5 minutes. Afterward, during the reception, people had crowded around him with praise and questions about his upcoming tour. But as the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, David felt that familiar restlessness creeping in. The compliments were starting to sound repetitive. The questions were ones he had answered 1,000 times before. He found himself looking for an escape from the polite conversations and forced smiles. That's when he heard it. Piano music drifting from the main ballroom next door. The same gentle background style he remembered from his last visit. Without excusing himself from the group of admirers surrounding him, David slipped away to investigate. Sure enough, there was Maria, sitting at the same baby grand piano, playing for another hotel event. This time it appeared to be a corporate dinner. Men in dark suits and women in cocktail dresses scattered throughout the room, most of them focused on their meals and business conversations. David watched from the doorway, a glass of champagne in his hand. The wine had been flowing freely at his own reception, and he was feeling more confident than usual. More critical, too. As he listened to Maria's playing, he found himself analyzing every phrase, every chord choice, every dynamic shift. She was playing Misty now, that old jazz standard that every piano player knew. Her version was competent, pleasant even, but it lacked the fire and complexity that David brought to his performances. Where was the passion? Where was the technical brilliance that separated true artists from mere entertainers? After finishing Misty, Maria transitioned into a medley of Broadway show tunes. David recognized Memory from Cats, followed by Somewhere from West Side Story. Nice choices for a dinner crowd, he thought condescendingly. Safe, predictable, and unthreatening. As Maria played, David noticed several guests approaching the piano with requests. Each time she listened politely and either played their request immediately or promised to work it into her next set. She had a warm, genuine smile that seemed to put people at ease. Even the busy executives paused their conversations to listen when she played their favorite songs. But then something happened that caught David's attention. A well-dressed woman in her 60s approached the piano during a brief pause between songs. "Excuse me, dear," the woman said with a refined British accent. "I wonder if you might know Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It's my late husband's favorite. Peace. Would have been our anniversary today." David straightened up, remembering the last time someone had requested that same piece. This was the moment of truth. Would Maria admit she couldn't handle such a demanding work? Or would she attempt it and reveal her limitations to everyone in the room? Maria's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "I do know the piece, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate for tonight's atmosphere. It's such an emotional and powerful work. It really deserves a proper concert setting where people can give it their full attention." The woman nodded understandingly, but David felt his jaw clench. There it was again, the same excuse he had heard 3 weeks ago. He was certain now that Maria was simply not capable of playing the piece. She was hiding behind politeness to avoid embarrassing herself. "Perhaps," Maria continued gently, "I could play something else that might remind you of your husband." "What other music did he enjoy?" The woman's eyes lit up. "He loved Debussy. Always said Clair de Lune reminded him of the night we met." Maria immediately began the opening notes of the beautiful piece, her touch suddenly more delicate and expressive than David had heard all evening. The entire room seemed to quiet as the haunting melody floated through the air. Even the waiters stopped their bustling to listen. David had to admit that her performance of the Debussy was lovely, but it was still just a pretty melody, not the kind of technically demanding work that separated the professionals from the amateurs. Anyone with decent training could play Clair de Lune convincingly. As the evening wound down and the corporate event began to break up, David made his decision. His own reception was ending anyway, and most of his guests had already left. This was the perfect opportunity to satisfy his curiosity about Maria's true abilities. He walked confidently into the ballroom, his chest puffed out with the lingering high of his successful performance. Several people from the corporate dinner recognized him immediately. "David Chen," exclaimed one man. "We heard you were performing next door. What an honor to have you here." The attention felt good, as it always did. David basked in the recognition as a small crowd gathered around him, but his eyes kept drifting to Maria, who was quietly organizing her sheet music at the piano bench. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced, his voice carrying across the room with practiced authority, "I hope you've enjoyed this lovely evening of music." Maria looked up, surprised by the sudden attention being drawn to the piano area. She clearly recognized David from his previous visit, but her expression remained politely neutral. "I couldn't help but notice," David continued, his tone friendly, but with an edge that only Maria seemed to detect, that our pianist here has been taking requests all evening. Quite skillfully, I might add. A small murmur of agreement rippled through the remaining guests. Maria looked uncomfortable with the sudden spotlight, but managed a gracious smile. David stepped closer to the piano, his champagne glass still in hand. I was particularly impressed by your Debussy just now. Beautiful phrasing. He paused, letting the compliment hang in the air before adding, though I noticed you declined to play the Chopin ballade when it was requested earlier. Maria's cheeks flushed slightly. As I explained to the lady, I felt it wasn't quite right for the setting. Oh, I completely understand, David interrupted smoothly. Context is everything in music. But I have to confess, I'm curious about your interpretation of that piece. It happens to be one of my signature works. The small crowd looked back and forth between them, sensing an undercurrent they couldn't quite identify. Maria seemed to realize that she was being challenged, but her response remained diplomatic. I'm sure your interpretation is magnificent, she said carefully. I've heard wonderful things about your performances. David felt a surge of satisfaction at her obvious deference, but it wasn't enough. The wine, the success of his own concert, and his growing certainty that Maria was out of her depth all combined to push him forward. You know what? He said, his voice taking on a more animated tone. Why don't we give these good people a real treat? A little musical conversation between colleagues. I could play something, then you could respond, and we'll see where the music takes us. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the town square. David watched Maria's face carefully, looking for signs of panic or retreat. Instead, he saw something that surprised him, a flash of what looked almost like annoyance in her dark eyes. I wouldn't want to impose on your evening, Maria said politely, but David could hear the steel beneath her words. Nonsense, David declared, spreading his arms wide to include the gathering crowd. Music is meant to be shared, isn't it? Besides, I'm sure everyone here would love to hear what happens when two pianists have a friendly musical chat. The remaining guests began to murmur with interest, clearly intrigued by the prospect of an impromptu musical duel. David could see that Maria was trapped. Refusing now would look like cowardice in front of all these people. Maria glanced around the room, perhaps looking for an escape route, but finding none. Finally, she nodded slowly. Very well, she said, quietly. But let's keep it light and fun for everyone. David's smile widened. He had her exactly where he wanted her. In a few minutes, he would demonstrate the vast difference between a true concert pianist and a talented amateur. It would be educational for everyone involved. Excellent, he said, moving toward the piano bench. Shall I start us off? David rolled up his sleeves and flexed his fingers, a gesture he had perfected over years of concert performances. The small crowd of remaining guests pressed closer, their conversations forgotten as they sensed they were about to witness something special. The hotel staff had even stopped clearing tables to watch. Since I suggested this little musical conversation, David announced with a confident smile, I suppose it's only fair that I go first. Maria stepped away from the piano bench, her hands clasped quietly in front of her. Her face showed no emotion, but David caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it concern? Fear? He couldn't tell, but it only added to his confidence. David settled onto the bench and adjusted his position, taking his time to build anticipation. He had chosen his opening piece carefully. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, No. 2. It was a crowd pleaser, a piece that never failed to dazzle audiences with its lightning-fast runs and dramatic flourishes. More importantly, it was technically brutal, requiring the kind of finger strength and speed that separated professionals from amateurs. He began with the slow, haunting introduction, his fingers caressing the keys with practiced precision. The melody was deceptively simple at first, almost melancholy, but David knew what was coming. He could feel the audience leaning in, drawn by the mysterious opening. Then came the explosion. David's hands erupted into motion, flying across the keyboard, with mechanical perfection. His left hand thundered out the bass notes while his right hand danced through impossible runs and arpeggios. The piano seemed to shake under the assault, filling the ballroom with sound that made the crystal glasses on nearby tables vibrate. David was in his element now, his body swaying with the music as his fingers found every note with laser precision. He had performed this piece hundreds of times in concert halls around the world, and muscle memory took over completely. His hands moved independently, like two well-trained athletes performing a synchronized routine. The audience was mesmerized. Several people had their phones out, recording the impromptu performance. David caught glimpses of their amazed faces as he played, their mouths slightly open in wonder at the sheer speed and complexity of what they were witnessing. As he approached the climax of the piece, David pulled out all the stops. His hands crossed and recrossed as he played, his fingers striking the keys with such force that the sound seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the piano itself. The final chords rang out like cannon shots, echoing through the ballroom long after. His hands had lifted from the keys. The applause was immediate and thunderous. People whistled and cheered, clearly amazed by what they had just witnessed. David stood and took a bow, his face flushed with exertion and triumph. He had just delivered a performance that would have been impressive in any concert hall, and he had done it as casually as someone might order coffee. "Magnificent," shouted someone from the crowd. "Absolutely incredible." David basked in the praise for a moment, then turned toward Maria with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your turn," he said, gesturing toward the piano bench. Maria approached slowly, her expression unreadable. David expected to see nervousness, maybe even panic, but instead she seemed almost calm. She sat down at the bench and placed her hands on the keys, but she didn't begin playing immediately. "That was beautiful," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the now quiet ballroom. Liszt wrote such passionate music. David waited for her to continue, to perhaps make some excuse about following such a virtuosic performance, but Maria simply closed her eyes for a moment and began to play. The first notes that emerged from the piano were so soft they were almost whispers. David recognized the piece immediately, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. It was a popular piece, one that many piano students attempted, but usually with mixed results. The melody was deceptively simple, but playing it well required something that technique alone couldn't provide. As Maria played, something strange happened in the ballroom. The energy that had been crackling through the air during David's performance seemed to settle into something deeper, more intimate. Where David's playing had been about power and speed, Maria's was about something else entirely. Her left hand created a gentle, rolling accompaniment that seemed to breathe with natural rhythm. But it was her right hand that held everyone spellbound. The melody floated above the accompaniment like a conversation between old friends, each phrase flowing naturally into the next. David found himself listening despite his determination to remain critical. He had heard this piece performed by countless students and professionals, but there was something different about Maria's interpretation. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was telling a story. The middle section of the Nocturne was where most pianists struggled. The melody became more complex, requiring delicate balance between the hands and subtle timing that couldn't be taught from a book. David watched Maria's hands carefully, looking for technical flaws he could point out later. Instead, he found himself drawn into the music. Maria's interpretation of this section was like listening to someone speak in a foreign language that somehow you understood perfectly. Her timing was flexible, breathing with the phrases in a way that made the music feel alive and spontaneous. But it was in the final section that Maria truly surprised everyone. As the familiar melody returned, she began to add subtle variations, nothing flashy or show-offy, but small changes that made the piece feel fresh and personal. A gentle trill here, a slight alteration in the harmony there, all woven so seamlessly into Chopin's original that they felt like natural extensions of the composer's thoughts. David felt his first real twinge of unease. This wasn't the playing of a hotel pianist struggling to keep up with a professional. This was the work of someone who understood music at a level that went beyond technical training. As Maria played the final dying notes of the Nocturne, the ballroom fell into complete silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The contrast with the Enthusiastic applause that had followed David's performance was stark and somehow more powerful. When the last note faded completely, the applause began, but it was different from before. Instead of the excited cheering that had greeted David's technical fireworks, this was quiet, almost reverent. People seemed reluctant to break the spell that Maria's playing had cast over the room. David felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of him wanted to dismiss what he had just heard as mere prettiness, lacking the technical challenge of his own performance. But another part of him, a part he had been ignoring for years, recognized something profound in Maria's playing. The woman, who had requested the Chopin Ballade earlier, approached the piano, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to Maria. "That was exactly what my heart needed to hear tonight." Maria smiled warmly and squeezed the woman's hand. "Music has a way of speaking to us when we need it most," she said softly. David watched this interaction with growing confusion. He was used to being the center of attention, the one receiving praise and gratitude. But there was something about the connection Maria had just made with that grieving woman that his own spectacular performance had failed to achieve. Still, he told himself, one lovely performance didn't prove anything. Anyone could play a simple nocturne with feeling. The real test would come when the pieces got more challenging, when raw technical skill became essential. David stepped forward, his competitive nature fully awakened now. "That was quite lovely," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Chopin always benefits from a gentle touch. The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Maria looked up at him with those dark eyes, and for just a moment David thought he saw a flash of something that looked almost like amusement. "Music is a conversation," Maria replied calmly. "Sometimes we need to whisper, sometimes we need to shout. The art is knowing which voice to use when." David felt challenged by her words, though he couldn't quite explain why. He moved back toward the piano, already planning his next piece, something that would require not just technical skill but musical sophistication that he was certain Maria couldn't match. The musical conversation was just beginning, and David was determined to have the last word. David wasn't about to let Maria's gentle performance shake his confidence. He had years of training, countless awards, and the respect of critics worldwide. One pretty piece played with feeling didn't change the fundamental truth. He was the abhor. Professional here, and she was just a hotel pianist who happened to have some natural talent. He cracked his knuckles and approached the piano bench with renewed determination. This time he would choose something that would definitively separate the amateurs from the masters. Something that required not just technical skill, but deep musical understanding and years of study. "I think it's time we raised the stakes a bit," David announced to the crowd, which had grown larger as word spread through the hotel about the impromptu musical battle happening in the ballroom. Hotel guests from other events had wandered in, and even some of the staff had gathered at the edges of the room. David settled at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, he declared. The solo piano arrangement. A murmur rippled through the audience. Even those who weren't classical music experts recognized this as a serious escalation. Rachmaninoff's second was legendary for its difficulty, a piece that demanded enormous hands, incredible stamina, and the kind of musical maturity that came only with years of professional experience. David began with the famous opening chords, those deep resonant tones that announced the concerto like a thunderclap. His hands stretched across the keyboard, reaching intervals that would be impossible for most pianists. The melody that followed was achingly beautiful but technically treacherous, requiring perfect balance between power and delicacy. As he played, David felt his confidence returning in full force. This was his territory, music that pushed the piano and the pianist to their absolute limits. His fingers navigated the complex passages with the ease of someone who had performed this piece with major orchestras around the world. Every note was placed with surgical precision, every dynamic marking observed to perfection. The second movement gave David a chance to showcase his lyrical playing, But even here, the technical demands were enormous. The melody soared above a complex accompaniment that required incredible independence between his hands. David had spent months perfecting this section years ago, and it showed in every phrase. But it was in the final movement that David truly unleashed his full arsenal. The music exploded into a whirlwind of octaves, arpeggios, and massive chords that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hotel. His hands moved like lightning, covering the entire keyboard in sweeping gestures that looked almost superhuman. The audience was completely captivated. Several people had their mouths hanging open in disbelief at what they were witnessing. This wasn't just piano playing. This was an athletic feat, a demonstration of human capability pushed to its absolute limit. David reached the thunderous climax, his entire body engaged in producing the massive sound that filled every corner of the ballroom. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he drove toward the final chords, which he delivered with such force that several people actually jumped. The silence that followed was brief, quickly broken by explosive applause. People were cheering, shouting, "Bravo!" and clapping until their hands hurt. David stood and took several bows, his chest heaving from the physical exertion of the performance. "Absolutely incredible," someone shouted from the crowd. "I've never heard anything like that," called another voice. David felt vindicated. This was what real piano playing looked like. This was the difference between a conservatory-trained professional and someone who just happened to be able to play a few pretty pieces. He turned toward Maria with a smile of triumph, expecting to see defeat and recognition of his superiority written across her face. Instead, Maria was smiling. Not the forced smile of someone who had been outclassed, but a genuine expression that seemed almost pleased. She began to applaud along with everyone else, her appreciation appearing completely sincere. "That was magnificent," she said, loud enough for David to hear over the continuing applause. Rachmaninoff would have been proud. David felt momentarily confused by her reaction. Where was the intimidation? Where was the admission that she couldn't possibly follow such a performance? Instead, Maria seemed energized, as if his playing had awakened something in her. "Your turn," David said, gesturing toward the piano with perhaps less confidence than he had felt moments before. Maria approached the bench, but instead of sitting down immediately, she turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "What you just heard was extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "David has shared with us the kind of technical mastery that takes decades to develop. It's truly inspiring." David felt a moment of satisfaction at her acknowledgement, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't finished. "Music, though," Maria continued, "has always been about conversation, not just between musicians, but between different traditions, different cultures, different ways of understanding the world." She sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. "This piece has been speaking to musicians for almost 300 years. I'd like to share what it says to me." The opening notes that emerged from the piano were immediately recognizable: Bach's Goldberg variations, specifically the aria that opens the entire work. But even from the first phrase, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. Maria's interpretation of the Bach was unlike anything David had ever heard. She played the familiar melody with such clarity and depth that it seemed like she was revealing secrets hidden in the music for centuries. But that was just the beginning. As she continued, Maria began to transform the Baroque masterpiece. The melody remained intact, but she started weaving in jazz harmonies, her left hand creating complex chord progressions that Bach himself might never have imagined, but which felt completely natural and right. David watched in growing amazement as Maria continued to evolve the piece. The Baroque melody morphed into a jazz ballad, then into something that sounded almost Latin, with rhythms that made several people in the audience unconsciously sway with the music. But Maria wasn't done. The Latin rhythms gave way to something that sounded like a conversation between Bach and Bill Evans, then between classical tradition and contemporary soul music. Through it all, the original melody remained recognizable, like a golden thread connecting centuries of musical tradition. What David was witnessing wasn't just technical skill, It was musical intelligence of a kind he had never encountered. Maria was demonstrating fluency in multiple musical languages, showing how they all connected to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The audience was transfixed. Unlike the appreciative but somewhat distant applause that had greeted David's technical fireworks, people were now completely absorbed in the musical journey Maria was taking them on. Some were nodding along with rhythms they felt but couldn't name. Others had tears in their eyes as familiar melodies appeared and disappeared in new contexts. David realized with growing horror that what he was hearing wasn't the work of a talented amateur who had gotten lucky with one pretty piece. This was the playing of someone who understood music at a level that made his own conservatory training look narrow and limited. As Maria continued her musical journey, people around the room began to whisper stories. David caught fragments of conversations that made his stomach sink. She was principal accompanist at the Met for 15 years, someone was saying. Turned down a recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon to teach kids in the South Bronx, another voice added. She has a doctorate from Juilliard, but she's been working in community music programs for the last decade. I heard she speaks 7 languages and can play music from every continent. Each whispered revelation hit David like a physical blow. Maria wasn't a hotel pianist who had stumbled into this job. She was a master musician who had chosen service over celebrity, education over ego. As Maria brought her improvisation to a close, weaving all the musical threads back into Bach's original aria, David felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't just his pride, it was his entire understanding of what it meant to be a musician. The final notes of Maria's performance seemed to hang in the air forever, as if the room itself was reluctant to let them go. When the applause finally began, it was different from anything David had heard before. Not just appreciation for technical skill, but genuine gratitude for a musical experience that had touched something deep in everyone present. David stood, at the edge of the crowd, no longer the center of attention, watching as people approached Maria not just to congratulate her, but to share their own stories and connections to the music she had just created. For the first time in his adult life, David Chen understood the difference between playing music and being a musician. The applause for Maria's performance seemed to go on forever. David stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, watching as people approached her with genuine emotion in their eyes. An elderly man was telling her how her music reminded him of his childhood in Cuba. A young woman was explaining through tears how the jazz section had sounded exactly like something her grandmother used to play. David felt like he was watching from outside his own body. Everything he thought he knew about music, about his place in the world, about what it meant to be successful, all of it was crumbling around him. The worst part wasn't that Maria had outplayed him. The worst part was that she had done it with such grace, such genuine joy in the music itself, that he couldn't even hate her for it. As the crowd around Maria began to thin out, she looked across the room and caught David's eye. Instead of the triumphant smirk he might have expected, or the pitying look that would have destroyed what remained of his ego, Maria simply smiled. It was a warm, genuine expression that somehow made David feel even worse about himself. She made her way through the remaining guests, accepting their thanks and compliments with the same humble grace she had shown all evening. When she finally reached David, he was surprised to find that his hands were shaking slightly. "That was beautiful," Maria said simply. "Thank you for sharing your music with everyone tonight." David stared at her, completely at a loss for words. She was thanking him? After what had just happened, after she had essentially redefined what musical excellence looked like, she was being gracious about his performance? David started, then stopped. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry for challenging her? That he hadn't known who she really was? That he felt like a fraud standing next to her? Maria seemed to sense his inner turmoil. "Would you like to play something together?" she asked quietly, her voice so gentle that only he could hear. "I think there's still music left in this conversation." David looked at her in amazement. After everything that had happened, after he had essentially ambushed her with this musical duel, after his obvious arrogance and condescension throughout the evening, she was offering him a way to save face. She was giving him a chance to be part of something beautiful instead of walking away in defeat. "I don't know if I can," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first honest thing he had said all evening. "Of course you can," Maria replied. "Music isn't a competition, David. It's a conversation. And the best conversations happen when people bring their authentic selves to the exchange." David felt something break open inside his chest. Not the crack he had felt earlier, but something deeper and more fundamental. For years, he had been performing a version of himself that he thought the world wanted to see. The confident virtuoso, the untouchable artist, the man who conquered stages and critics alike. But standing here, facing Maria's quiet wisdom, he realized how exhausting it had been to maintain that facade. "What would you like to play?" he asked, his voice steadier now. Maria thought for a moment. "Something that speaks to both of us. Something that lets us both be honest." She walked to the piano and sat down, leaving room on the bench beside her. David hesitated for just a moment, then joined her. It felt strange, sharing the bench with another pianist. Throughout his career, the piano had always been his solitary domain, his place of complete control. Debussy's Clair de Lune, Maria suggested, but let's play it as a duet, 4 hands, 1 heart. David knew the piece well, everyone did. It was beautiful, but not technically challenging, the kind of music that relied more on feeling than fireworks. As they began to play together, David found himself following Maria's lead, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see where she would take the music. Her interpretation was different from his usual approach. Where he typically played with crystalline precision, Maria brought a more fluid, breathing quality to the phrases. David found himself adapting, softening his touch, allowing space for silence and subtlety that he normally rushed past in his eagerness to impress. As they played, something magical happened. The music became a true conversation, with David's more structured approach blending with Maria's intuitive flow. When she played the melody, he discovered harmonies he had never noticed before. When he took the lead, she found ways to support and enhance without overwhelming. For the first time in years, David wasn't thinking about technique or impression or critical reviews. He was simply making music with another human being, and it felt like coming home to a place he had forgotten existed. The small audience that remained in the ballroom listened in absolute silence. This wasn't a performance in the traditional sense. It was something more intimate and honest. 2 musicians sharing their souls through sound, finding common ground in their mutual love of beauty. When the final notes faded away, there was no applause. The moment felt too sacred for that kind of response. Instead, people began to quietly disperse, some wiping away tears, all of them carrying something special with them as they left. David and Maria sat together at the piano bench for a long moment, neither wanting to break the spell that their music had created. "Thank you," David said finally, and this time he meant it completely. "Thank you for being willing to be vulnerable," Maria replied. "That's when the real music happens." As the ballroom emptied out, David found himself helping Maria pack up her sheet music. It was such a simple, ordinary task, but it felt profoundly meaningful after everything that had happened. "Can I ask you something?" David said as they worked. "Why didn't you tell me who you were, about your background, your training, your experience?" Maria smiled as she organized her music into neat stacks. "Would it have changed anything? Would you have listened differently if you had known about my degrees or my years at the Met?" David thought about this seriously. "Probably," he admitted. "I might have been more respectful, but I also might have been more guarded, more concerned with proving myself worthy of your attention." "Exactly," Maria said. "Music doesn't care about our credentials. It only cares about what we bring to it in the moment. Tonight, you brought your whole self, your skill, your passion, your vulnerability, and yes, even your arrogance. All of that made the music more interesting." David felt a laugh escape him, surprising them both. "I was pretty arrogant, wasn't I?" "Spectacularly so," Maria agreed with a grin. "But you're also incredibly talented. The question is what you're going to do with that talent now. David packed the last of Maria's music into her bag and handed it to her. "I think I need to learn how to listen," he said. "Really listen. Not just to music, but to people. To life." Maria nodded approvingly. "That's where the best music comes from. Not from trying to impress others, but from paying attention to the world around us and finding ways to translate that into sound." As they walked toward the ballroom exit together, David felt like a different person than the one who had entered this room hours ago. His career would continue, his concerts would go on, but something fundamental had shifted in how he understood his relationship with music. "Maria," he called as they reached the door, Would you consider giving me lessons? Not piano, lessons. I think I've got the technical stuff covered, but lessons in what you showed me tonight. How to make music that matters." Maria's smile was radiant. "I thought you'd never ask," she said. "Let's start next week. And David, bring your curiosity, not your ego." As David walked out into the cool, night air, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had come to this hotel as David Chen, celebrated pianist. He was leaving as David Chen, student of music. And for the first time in his adult life, the second title felt infinitely more valuable than the first. The city lights twinkled around him as he made his way home, but David barely noticed them. His mind was already racing with questions about music, about teaching, about the difference between performing and communicating. He had so much to learn, so much to discover about the art form he thought he had already mastered. Tomorrow he would cancel his next recording session, not because he was giving up on his career, but because he wanted to spend time learning how to bring the honesty and vulnerability he had discovered tonight into everything he played. The critics might not understand at first, but David had a feeling that his audiences would. After all, everyone could recognize the difference between music that impressed and music that touched the soul. Tonight, he had finally learned which one mattered more.